Pastor Ed has told me that the strongest, or some of the strongest evidence, is the Jesus's appearances, and you can also relate that to the empty tomb, which we'll get to in another section. But right now we're going to be talking about appearances, and so I wanted to cover a little background, and basically this is on hallucinations, because the alternative or natural explanation is that Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, but instead there were hallucinations. And so there's been two studies. There's been a 14,000 person-ish study that found 7.8% of men and 12% of women reported at least one vivid hallucinatory experience, most commonly a living person who was not present, and there were some religious supernatural content. 1 out of 4 normal people reported having at least one hallucinatory experience, and 39% report an auditory experience. A century later, 18,572 people found 13% having at least one vivid hallucination. Only 1% of the population has schizophrenia. And if a person subscribes to things like ghosts or whatever their culture is, then they are more likely to see that thing. And stress and emotional arousal, grief, trauma, personal anguish all increase the failure of what's called source monitoring, which is the skill to determine reality. Those who experience bereavement visions most likely or almost always assume the experience was real. And just in my own family, my mom, my grandpa, and I have all had hallucinatory experiences. Visions are also more commonly experienced when a person has a sense of guilt over some aspect of the relationship. All of them felt guilty over Jesus' death. Virgin Mary, there has been several appearances for her. One in Betania, Venezuela, where Virgin Mary appeared to this lady named Mary between 1976 and 1984 multiple times. Up to 1,000 people observed Mary at a local waterfall in Venezuela, including smart people like doctors, psychologists, and lawyers. In Cairo, Egypt, at a Coptic church, Mary appeared various times between a few years. She appeared on a roof, and 4 Coptic bishops authenticated the vision. Mary was also seen by Muslims, which can help to explain somebody like Paul's conversion, who was against Christianity at the time. So even people that aren't a part of the religion or even against the religion can have these hallucinations. So specifically relating to Jesus' followers were apocalyptic Jews that believed in an afterlife that entailed a resurrection of the dead. So just like how people who believe in ghosts are more likely to see ghosts, well, apocalyptic Jews are more likely to see a risen Jesus, because that's what they were told would happen. That's what they believed would happen. Jesus was beloved by his followers and died suddenly and tragically. He was deeply mourned and grieved. So this is the bereavement. They all betrayed him, which again lends back to what was mentioned earlier. And so I'm not saying that he didn't rise from the dead, but I'm saying based on what we just read, would it be unreasonable to assume that a handful of people had hallucinations of Jesus after his death, and all they did was simply believe that he rose from the dead, not that he actually did? And so let's look at the appearance cases in the actual Bible. We've got a bunch of different explanations that we'll get to in a minute, but let's look here. So the 500 people, the appearances to 500 people is literally just a claim in the Bible about appearing to 500 people. There's no way to prove that. There's no way, we don't know who they are, where, or anything about them. It's just something that says 500 people. So we have no way to prove that. And Pastor Ed himself admits and acknowledges that this is not proof.
That's the same thing. Just because the Bible says that 500 people saw Jesus is not in and of itself proof for somebody sitting outside. Nor is an outside historian saying the Christians believe that, neither does that prove that it actually happened.
So we have a small variety of appearances. So we have individual appearances, like 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, where he appears to Cephas Peter. And then there's mass hallucinations or appearances where, like with the 500, and then there's others like in John where they're fishing and then they saw him, and then in Mark he appears to 11 people at the same time. And so what we were thinking, or what Pastor Ed was thinking, was that the strongest evidence for him actually rising from the dead was that if it was hallucinations, it would have required a bunch of people to hallucinate at the same time and see the same thing. And then also there were physical attributes of some of the hallucinatory encounters. So it would be impossible, most likely, to have a hallucination that lasts for 3 days and you actually have scales on your face and you're blinded for 3 days. So that's kind of like evidence, right? And I would agree with that. If I had a hallucination for 3 days and my eyes were shut, like forced shut, and had scales on them, then I would most likely believe, whatever supernatural thing is happening to me. So I would believe in that supernatural, because that just doesn't happen based on our worldview. Unfortunately, these mass hallucinations don't work. So let's look at some of these appearance cases and analyze them. So first of all, the 500 is just, there's no way to corroborate it. We don't know who or where they were or anything like that. And the only claim is in the Bible. So this is not proof for that. And then the other ones, like, so 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, he appeared to Cephas Peter and then to the 12. The challenge with this one is that the author is Paul. Paul is not one of the 12, and he's not Peter. So Paul is just writing this down. So he's writing about the 12. He's not one of them. He wasn't there. So this isn't an eyewitness account where he experienced with 11 other people the appearance. So Paul could have easily just written this down to be convincing or something. It's much more likely than a dead man raising from the dead. 1 Corinthians 15:6 to the 500, it's the same thing. There's simply no way to verify that. So 1 Corinthians 15:8, the author is also Paul, and this appearance is to himself. And last of all, they was seen of me also. This one does not describe him being blinded. Then there's Galatians 1:16, where he appears to Paul, and it says he was pleased to reveal his son to me. And then there's an interesting commentary on Galatians 1:18-19, I think. After 3 years, I went to visit Cephas Peter and remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So there are a couple other appearances. And then Mark 16, first appeared to Mary, 2 disciples, and then to the 11. So in this case, Jesus could have appeared in Mark 16, or the author of Mark, which is apparently John Mark, could have just written it down. He was not one of the 11. He was also not an eyewitness to the appearance of the 11, because he wasn't one of the 11, so he wasn't there. This also doesn't explicitly state that he appeared to all 11 disciples at the same time. He could have received the claims of these appearances orally or from a written source and then just written it down. He also could have wanted to make the situation sound more divine, and therefore he appeared to all of the 11. So all of those situations are much more likely than a dead person actually rising from the grave. Matthew 28 was not actually written by Matthew the disciple, but let's give apologists the benefit of the doubt. We'll say the author was one of the disciples, Matthew. Matthew used Mark as a source, so the idea of Jesus appearing to all 11 after his death was not an original thought. He could have just written it down because it was in Mark, whether it was true or not, or whether he believed it or not. He could have misremembered or been convinced that he saw Jesus because it was suggested to him by the book of Mark. I'm sure, I've had situations where people are like, don't you remember that happening? And then I'm like, yeah, I think I do, even though I hadn't originally thought it. It had been suggested to me, and then I remembered it. Your brain is not a reliable source. He could have also been one of the people to genuinely have a hallucination that Jesus appeared and wrote down that all the 11 and the women saw because he himself saw, and then he just assumed that the other 11 and the women saw. In Luke, Jesus appears to 2 of them, Cleopas, and to the 11, and the author of Luke is Luke. Luke was not one of the 11, so this is not an eyewitness account. In Acts 1:3, he presented himself alive to them, and after suffering by many proofs, appearing to them for 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. This author is Luke, who is not one of the 12. We have no other information about the 40 days or many proofs other than that Acts says that it happened. So this again is not an eyewitness account, and the other thing in Acts is where Paul had scales and was blinded. This was also written by Luke. So this is most likely just Luke making an addition to make the story more compelling. So this again is not proof. Even if it was Luke that had written about his own experience with scales being blinded, it doesn't really prove anything other than that somebody wanted to write it down in the stories or in the books. The other eyewitness or potentially eyewitness account is in John 20. This one is written by an anonymous author, and it's about when they were going fishing, Jesus appeared to them. And the issue with this is that Jesus died in 30 to 36 CE. John was written around 90 CE. So at the most, John would have had to be a maximum of 20 years old, and he would have still written the book when he was 84 years old. So he probably was senile by that time, or definitely didn't remember correctly, especially considering that the possibility that God is not preserving his book or his scripture perfectly when, with oral traditions, because he hadn't with written traditions either, because the scribes had incorrectly translated the text. So whether or not the appearances are good evidence or not is, analyzing this is a little complicated. But the summary here is that Jesus could have rose from the dead and appeared as it says in the Bible, but it's much more likely that Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead. Instead, Paul probably hallucinated that he saw Jesus. In Galatians 1:12, it says that he got info from a revelation. So this might mean that all scriptures Paul wrote came directly from God, meaning zero collaboration would have had to be made with others. So he could have just written all of his own writings without consulting any of the disciples. And then Peter was supposedly illiterate. Acts 4:13 says so. There's some debate on whether or not Peter was actually written by Peter, or whether or not he actually was illiterate. So Peter hallucinated that he saw Jesus, assuming that Peter did write this and affirm Paul's writings, like he did in his book Peter, 1st or 2nd Peter. So because he affirms Paul's writings in one of his books. So if that is the case, and he actually did write Peter, then he probably had a hallucination too. And Matthew was most likely not written by the disciple, but if he was, or if that book was, then Matthew likely had a hallucination. The book of John is an anonymous source, so how reliable can we say an anonymous source is? Like, is he being truthful? Is he remembering correctly 64 years later? And assuming all of those things are valid, then the author of John probably had a hallucination too. But we're already dealing with a lot of potential variables where anything could go wrong. And with all these potential unknowns, it doesn't really speak to divine supernatural evidence that proves a God. Pastor Ed himself even graded this evidence of the appearances as an 80 out of 100 if we were using this in a courtroom. Another thing, a couple things to consider, is all of these people were supposedly friends. Paul had the hallucination, maybe some others did, maybe one person talking about it caused the others to have a hallucination. Similar to how a Pentecostal church revival will have everyone falling over because everyone else is falling over. If my friend falls over, then I'm more likely to believe it myself and fall over myself. So it's just kind of like a mass hysteria kind of thing. The authors may have made assumptions about the others having seen Jesus because they themselves hallucinated. And so Pastor Ed's main defense here is that the disciples would have rebuked each other for lying or spreading rumors that weren't true. Like Paul wrote down that that the 11 saw Jesus when they in fact didn't. So the reality is that multiple factions argued endlessly over the first few centuries about orthodoxy. The Ebionites thought Jesus was a Jewish Messiah, and you had to be Jewish and follow Old Testament law. They were not fans of Paul and thought he was preaching heresy. They also didn't think Jesus was divine. The Marcionites thought you could not be Jewish if you were Christian. They thought Jesus was an entirely different God. So essentially, everyone was arguing with everyone about what the actual truth was. The disciples could have easily been rebuking each other's writings, and the messages would have still been spread, whether they were true or not. And so after discussing with Pastor Ed the appearances and the evidences for and against, whether or not Jesus actually rose from the dead and appeared to the disciples and the women, he gave it a grade as assuming that the Bible was on trial in a courtroom, and this is what he had to say.
If I were on trial, that's evidence is not strong enough to refute what I'm saying. I don't know if that makes sense.
Kind of. It sounds like it could go either way, is what I'm hearing.
Right. Like, it's not strong enough to disprove my claims, but it is strong enough to have reasonable doubt of my claims.
Okay.
Okay, I think it's a refuting versus like reasonable doubt.
Yeah. So if we put the Bible on trial, and
Right.
we were saying, so for both cases, we have the Bible on trial, saying, so I'm accusing the Bible of being false,
Right.
and so if the court was to give a grade on and so the Bible's defense is this information about how Paul knew these people, he was with his friends, and they're likely to correct the issues. Those are the Bible's defenses. That is true.
You know what? I'm sorry, I've confused the whole thing. Because I was thinking about what you were saying, not what I was saying. So what I was grading was the idea of that they were misremembering things, that there was hallucinations.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I have it backwards.
Sure. So you would say 80 out of 100 then.
For this?
For the Bible, you would give
I would say 80 out of 100.
So the strongest evidence that supports the Bible's truth gets a B, a low B. One more point down and it would have been a C. The strongest evidence for an all-powerful God is only 80% convincing. You'll also notice that he just told me that it's reasonable to doubt that Jesus rose from the dead. You would think an almighty, all-powerful, eternally supreme God would provide overwhelming evidence that cannot be denied. Instead, he provides evidence that suggests, yeah, he could have risen from the dead, but there's also several ways that explain why he didn't rise from the dead. If God is perfect, shouldn't his evidence be perfect?